It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about his book, Saints and Sinners in the Cristero War, Stories of Martyrdom from Mexico, is the author, Father James Murphy. Thanks for being here, Father Murphy.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, how did you get interested in the Cristero War, and what drew you to the topic?
Well, I was visiting some friends in Mexico. This is way back in the 80s in Mexico City, and their dad fought in the Cristero War and was still alive. So we talked, and he had all kinds of stories about it, and the difficult conditions under which they fought in that war, going for days without food. And he described, ill-equipped. They were very ill-equipped, these soldiers were, these rebels. And he describes facing the withering arms of the federal forces in terror one day, and he actually defecated in his pants. He was so terrified.
Wow.
Then he would come home after a few months, and they'd have to burn his clothes. They were so bad, with his hair full of lice. They fought under very, very difficult conditions. It's amazing that they did so well, considering these were basically ragtag people who didn't have any arms or professionalism or training, and yet they were enormously successful against the Mexican government, protesting persecution, by the way.
Yeah, can you give us a brief history on the whole situation of the war? We think of Mexico as a predominantly Catholic country. So how did an anti-Catholic persecution begin in the first place?
Well, Mexico has had church-state problems going all the way back to the 18th century. As soon as Mexico got its independence from Spain, shortly afterwards, radicals took over the country. These were people who were influenced by the French Revolution and were basically believed that all religion was superstition. And they basically believed that Mexico's problems came down to the Catholic Church was the cause. They took over Mexico. What happened was it ended up being very polarized. They polarized the country into those who agreed with them that religion was superstition and waste of time, and those who appreciated their Spanish heritage and their Catholic heritage. And it ended up in a brutal war called the War of the Reform from 1858 to 1861. It was a brutal war that they ransacked churches and burned statues in the streets. That continued, that sentiment continued, and the Cristero War in the 1920s was basically a reenactment of the same thing. Where they ransacked churches and burned statues in the streets and harassed priests and arrested priests. During the Calles presidency, from 1924 to 1928, 90 priests were murdered.
Wow.
Yeah.
This was less than 100 years ago and not far from us here in the United States, but I feel like this isn't very well known. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's not well known in Mexico because the polarization was so bad that when the war was finally settled, it was so tense that they didn't mention it in schools, even in Catholic schools. They didn't mention it. So people in Mexico, while they were aware of the martyrs and celebrated the martyrs in their local parishes, there were so many of them, and the memories in their own families, were never taught the history behind the thing, how it happened, and the causes.
Because they were afraid that people would get upset and retaliate again?
Right. It was politically too sensitive. And the church, when they finally ended the war, the church was, holding on to its existence and was surviving under a very hostile government. One Vatican official, as late as the 80s, said that Mexico was surviving under the most anti-Catholic constitution on the planet. They had this constitution that was very anti-Catholic. What sparked the Cristero War, the immediate cause, was a most unusual action taken by the Mexican bishops. The straw that broke the camel's back was the 1917 Constitution, which was very anti-Catholic. And then there was a law called the Calles Law that President Calles implemented that said that state legislatures had the power to control the number of priests who worked in each diocese. In other words, the priests had to have a license, like doctors or dentists, and the state would give that license. The purpose was to reduce the number of priests. They would restrict the number of licenses, and they were doing this. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. So the bishops made this most unusual decision in the 20th century. They basically went on strike. They closed down every single church in Mexico. in protest against this ridiculous persecution. So on the August 1st, 1926, suddenly the churches are closed. No masses, no funerals, no sick visits, no bells in the square. And the people were absolutely shocked at this. But of course, they didn't blame the bishops, they blamed the government. That led to spontaneous riots in various rural parts of Mexico. They were not connected, they were just basically riots where they would overrun the barracks. They would take over the horses and the guns. But they should have really have been crushed in like a week or 10 days. In fact, they weren't crushed. It escalated and escalated and escalated. And it went on for 3 years. And by the end of the war, the government had lost 12 generals, 70 colonels, and 1,800 officers. Over 200,000 people lost their lives, both civilians and combatants in the war.
So the title of your book is Saints and Sinners in the Cristero War. Can you talk about some of the saints that you feature in the book?
Well, let's start with the sinners, because that's the stage under which they became martyrs. The biggest sinner in the book, I would say, would be this President Calles. He was the president from 1924 to 1928. He was a fanatical atheist who literally, and a social engineer, who literally wanted to eliminate the church from the land, just get rid of Catholicism. He was obsessed with Catholicism. The American ambassador, James Sheffield, wrote back to the State Department at one point and said, he says, this guy here, this president in Mexico, the guy, when religion comes up, his face gets red, he pounds the table, he just loses control. This is now an official document at the State Department. He was the one who brought the thing to a head, Calles. There were others. There was the famous governor of Tabasco. He was Tomás Garrido Canabal. He was, again, a notorious atheist, anti-Catholic, and he basically persecuted the church in the state of Tabasco. Then he got a federal job in the cabinet, and he had these paramilitary kids. They were teenagers called red shirts. And they would, on Saturdays, they would have these celebrations in the courtyard of the Agricultural Department of Mexico City, and they would burn statues and burn holy books that they would plunder from the churches during the week. The saints, the most famous one probably would be Father Miguel Pro, famous Jesuit, who was in Mexico City, and for 18 months he was on the most wanted list in Mexico City, and he kept slipping through the hands of the police who wanted to get him because they felt he was one of the brains behind the Cristero War, and they were determined to get him. He was saying masses in homes, which were illegal, of course, to say mass outside a church, and he was doing communion stations for people, and they were trying to catch him, and they would keep missing him. One morning, for example, he is celebrating a mass early in the morning in this private home. And he gets there at 6 a.m. and he sees 2 federal police at the door waiting to arrest him. They were tipped off, of course. So he walks up. He was a famous mime, a famous actor. He brazenly walks up to them and takes out a pencil and paper and takes down the number of the house and says, "What's going on here?" he says. And then he flashes open his coat as if he were showing them his badge. In fact, he didn't have a badge. But he flashed it fast, and they thought they saw a badge. So he walked in, and they saluted him on the way in. He goes upstairs to the terrified people and told them, "Calm down, just leave one by one. There will be no mass, obviously. I will leave first and just leave slowly." Leaves and goes back out and gets another salute. That was an example of his tactics. He eventually was caught. He was executed in Mexico City. And in that case, Calles decided to make an example of him to the world. He wanted to show the world how these subversive communist priests or subversive priests were so difficult to deal with, and they were undermining his government. And so he decides to shoot him by firing squad. No trial, of course. He was shot by firing squad. He invited in the journalists and photographers to see it. So photographers were there, photographed the execution, and the following day this thing was out in the world press. These photographs of him being shot. The reaction of the public was the opposite to what Calles intended. Calles thought this would be an example to the public of what's going on in Mexico and the difficult time he had running the country. In fact, the reaction was the opposite. There was shock, revulsion, that a civilized government would just execute priests without trial and without any accusations. If you, by the way, Google Father Miguel Pro, you'll see on the internet, you'll see the photographs, the famous photographs. Others, there was the famous Archbishop of Guadalajara. He was the Archbishop. He was the most outspoken member of the hierarchy, very, very articulate, dynamic personality, and feared and hated by the government. He was exiled 5 times from his diocese. 5 times. For several years, he ran the archdiocese from hiding. He was hiding in the poor homes of the Indians in the rural part of Mexico, and he actually ran the archdiocese. Each week, a poor Indian would go into Guadalajara with letters to the parishes and mail back and forth. And at one time, he describes in his memoirs how he's in this poor hut of Indians, and it's on a dirt floor, and he's sleeping on the floor, and he's reading his prayers before he goes to sleep, and he has a candle burning. The next thing he notices, a snake crawling over his feet. And so he has to stay quiet and calm until the unwelcome visitor passes on. But he boasts in his memoirs that he said, I was protected, he said, by the reverent silence of 15,000 people to whom I'll be eternally grateful. The people just would not betray his presence, and he was going from parish to parish and doing baptisms and masses and confessions, and again the feds could not, they kept missing him. Eventually he was arrested and expelled. 5 times in all he was expelled.
In a way that reminds me of some of the stories of St. Paul, of this kind of writing letters and being imprisoned and wow.
Well, right, being and going through all these vicissitudes. Yes, he was a great man. I think his cause for canonization has begun. He's not officially canonized yet. He's buried in the cathedral in Guadalajara, and the sculpture on his tomb is the sculpture of a wounded lion, which is very, very appropriate. He was a lion and was enormously admired by the people. The more the government chased him down, the more the people admired him and lionized him.
Yeah.
There were others. There was Toribio Romo, a simple country priest who was shot in his bed one morning during Lent. In Tequila, he was actually assigned to the town of Tequila, from which the drink gets its name. He was out he was hiding in a canyon outside the town. He was just shot in his bed. Another one was Anacleto Gonzalez Flores. He's a famous attorney from Guadalajara, a brilliant man and an incredibly wonderful speaker and writer. He organized a boycott against the 1917 Constitution and against that law that restricted the number of priests, and he actually paralyzed the economy of Jalisco in about 6 months, and the government had to give in and back off on the new law in the state of Jalisco. He was enormously successful. Eventually he was tortured and he was shot. A brutal torture. He's known as the Mahatma Gandhi of Mexico. He was very, very convinced of nonviolent methods.
Yeah.
So he was reluctant to go along with the Cristero War. The Cristero War was, of course, a violent, it was meeting violence with violence.
Sure.
The bishops went along with it because the just war theory at the time said that if all, nonviolent methods failed, and there was a chance of success, that violent revolution to defend religious liberty would be justified.
Yeah. Well, I have so many more questions, and there's so much to learn about this, but people are just going to have to get the book to learn more about it. So where should we send people to get a copy of it?
Well, you can get the book on Amazon. Sacramento, where I am, of course, has 2 bookstores here, and it's available in those 2 bookstores, the Catholic Store and Easter's Books, but it's also on Amazon.
All right. Again, it's called Saints and Sinners in the Cristero War, Stories of Martyrdom from Mexico. Thank you so much, Father James Murphy, for joining us today and shedding a little light on this historical event. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.